Hello, HHT community, and welcome to our latest webinar. Sorry for the bit of delay here, some technical difficulties on this side that we managed to work through. My name is Riley Blevins. I'm the Senior Director of Global Community Engagement here at Cure HHT, and I will be moderating today's session. So why are we here? Lately, there's been a wave of exciting news in the world of HHT, new clinical trials and results, interest from industry and biotech companies, and so much more. Today, you will have the chance to understand more about these happenings, why they offer reasons for hope, and how one day they may impact you, the patients. But before we jump in, I first want to make you aware of some important news and announcements here at the Foundation. First up, I wanted to encourage everyone here to enroll in HHT Connect if you have not done so already. HHT Connect is the first ever global HHT patient registry. Our goal here is simple: to collect healthcare information from as many HHT patients as possible so that researchers and doctors can discover patterns and clues that can help them better understand HHT and develop new treatments over time. By answering a handful of simple questions, you can help advance HHT research and do so all from the comfort of your own home. Again, I would strongly encourage everyone here to visit our website, learn more, and consider signing up today. Next up, and simply put, there is no better way to ensure you and your family is up to date on the latest in HHT treatment, management, and care than by attending one of our conferences. We're excited to share that our next regional conference will be in Denver on May 29th, 2025. As part of this event, we will have a special Kids Day program, so please do check that out. Even more exciting, this event is completely free. Space is limited, so please do register soon if you are considering. Some notable speakers we'll have at our event include Dr. Andy White, Dr. Murali Chakanala, and Dr. Peter Huntress. More information will be linked here in the chat, so do please click on those links. Next, by sharing your story with us in Washington, you have the opportunity to help us grow and protect badly needed HHT federal funding. If you have not heard, we are hosting a Capitol Hill Day in DC on February 11th and 12th, and we need as many volunteers as possible. Absolutely no experience is necessary or required. If you're passionate about HHT, this is an opportunity for you. Since we were finally successful in unlocking federal funding for our centers of excellence just 2 years ago, we've seen an incredible 44% increase in new patients seen at HHT centers. But this funding is not promised or guaranteed every year, and our goal is to one day be able to fund every center. But the nonprofit organizations who are successful in advocating for themselves and growing federal funding, they send as many volunteers as possible. So please do email sparkchange@curehht.org. Again, that's sparkchange@curehht.org if you're interested to learn more. Our webinar today is brought to you by Bleed Cease. Stop bleeding fast and easy. Click the link in the chat to receive a free sample of Bleed Cease, and we thank them for their generous support in helping make content like this possible. Next up, if you haven't heard, we've recently expanded criteria for our newest clinical trial, the pazopanib study, which you may just hear more about in a second. Please check out our website for more information and to see a recording that will help answer all of your questions about this trial. If this trial is successful, this drug could become one of the first FDA-approved medications for HHT, which would be a huge milestone, but we need more patients. So please do visit our website to learn more. We are excited to announce a partnership study with Diagonal Therapeutics. More information to come soon, but this is a paid study that you can do right from your phone. Learn more at curehht.org/HHT impact. One more time, and we'll link it in the chat, curehht.org/HHT impact. Lastly, we're thrilled to announce that a generous group of donors has agreed to match the first $250,000 we raised before the end of the year. That means your donations to our organization and to support our mission to end suffering from HHT, the impact of those gifts will be doubled through the end of the year. We're nearly there, which is hard to believe, and we do have plenty of matched dollars remaining. So please consider a gift today to support our work to advance HHT treatment, research, knowledge, and care. At Cure HHT, we're so much more than a patient advocacy organization. We're a force that drives advancements in research and care, playing a critical role in many of the advancements you will hear about this afternoon. Visit curehht.org to support our work with a gift today. I mean it when I say it. Every dollar, every gift, no matter the size, truly makes a difference. Finally, before we get underway, I want to go over some housekeeping rules for the webinar to make this event as interactive as possible. If you have a question for Dr. Al-Samkari, please type it into the Q&A box to the right of your screen. We recommend that you keep your questions general in nature so they benefit everyone. I'll ask as many questions as time allows. We'll be posting resources relevant to tonight's topic in the chat box. You can use the chat field to make comments to either an individual or all participants on the webinar. But again, please do not post questions for our presenter in the chat box. All questions should go in the Q&A box. This presentation is being recorded, and that recording, if you'd like to view this at a later date or share it with family members, will be saved in the Cure HHT website's resource library. And lastly, at the end of the discussion, you will be emailed a brief survey. Please do take a few minutes to fill that out. Your input is critical for the development of future webinars. We want to make sure that our content and educational opportunities are relevant to you, the patients. And with that, let's get going. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari. Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari is a hematologist and clinical investigator at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, as well as the associate director of the MGH HHT Center of Excellence. He's a clinical investigator. Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari serves as the principal investigator for several clinical trials at any given time in HHT and other hematological diseases, enabling him to offer new and promising treatment options to patients where it makes sense. At the end of our presentation, Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari has graciously agreed to take some questions, so we'll hold about a 30-minute moderated Q&A session. And with that, Dr. Al-Samkari, I'll turn things over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Riley. Thank you to Cure HHT for the invitation to speak to everyone in this very, very important webinar on this really critically important topic. It's so amazing to me that over the last even just 5 years, things look totally different for HHT than they did back then. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to have a similar leap forward in terms of the research being done, the therapeutics available for patients. Riley, is my slides or are my slides showing well?
Yep, looks great.
All right, perfect. So the title of this webinar is Entering the Therapeutics Age, New Era for HHT Treatment. And so, what does that mean, entering the therapeutics age? I'm going to take just a second. I know there's a lot of people on this webinar who for most of their lives, never had any access to any medication that was effective to treat this disease. And the way that the disease was treated was really with supportive treatment, things like giving you IV iron and iron pills to treat anemia, cauterizations or laser treatments in the nose to treat nose bleeding, cauterizations in the gastrointestinal tract to treat gastrointestinal bleeding, embolizations of AVMs in the lungs or the brain, for example, to prevent those AVMs from causing trouble. But we're really in a place now, thanks to efforts from so many amazing scientists that have devoted their careers to this disease, that we understand what's going on in HHT much better than we did before. And really over the last 2 decades, which seems like it may be a lot of time, but in the realm of science and medical understanding is really not a lot of time at all. We've gone from very little understanding of this disease to quite a bit more understanding of exactly what's going wrong. And it's so important to have that understanding, because when you know what's going wrong at the cellular level, at the protein level, it means that you can develop medications, therapeutics, and that's the therapeutics age here, therapeutics that specifically address that problem. And so you don't have to rely on burning telangiectasias, which we know, while it can be very helpful in the short term, does not solve the problem in the long term. And actually, we now know sets people up for worse bleeding down the road because of the disease process itself. So what we're really looking to do is give people medications that are disease modifying, number one, and number two, are truly what we call hemostatic, meaning they stop bleeding. So disease modifying medications shrink the telangiectasias down and are often hemostatic, and hemostatic medications may or may not be disease modifying, but they achieve a similar goal without having to sort of brute force your way into getting rid of the telangiectasias with a procedure, with laser, with these things that, we know cause injury to the very delicate tissue in the nose and the gastrointestinal tract and so on. So here are my disclosures. I want to empower everybody listening to this webinar to know a bit more about your disease and to know the importance of your disease before I launch into specifics on treatments and new treatments. HHT, I really feel, and many people agree, is a neglected disease. So you may feel that this is a rare disease, and it technically meets the definition of a rare disease per the FDA, but it is in the bleeding disorder space, it is actually not very rare. It's the second most common inherited bleeding disorder in the world. There are 80,000 people in the United States with HHT and 1.4 million people worldwide with HHT, which in the scheme of rare disorders is really not that rare. I like to say not so uncommon disorder when I talk about HHT. And it's a multi-system disorder, to be sure. We recognize, obviously, that HHT leads to arteriovenous malformations, these abnormal blood vessels in organs, most commonly lung, liver, and brain. But the thing that unites everybody, almost everybody, about 98% of folks with HHT, is the bleeding. And so it's classified by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as an inherited bleeding disorder. And it's the second most common inherited bleeding disorder, the most common being von Willebrand disease, which is usually a mild disease, not always, but usually a mild disease, whereas HHT, as we know, is a progressive disease. It gets worse over the lifespan. So for every man with hemophilia, which is the most commonly thought of bleeding disorder, when people think of, oh, bleeding disorder, what's the classic bleeding disorder that comes to mind? It's hemophilia, but hemophilia is a disease of men. It's an X-linked disease. So the vast, vast majority of people with hemophilia are men because they only have one X chromosome and women have two X chromosomes. And so women are carriers and men have the disease. For every man with hemophilia, there is a woman and a man with HHT. And so that's something that it's really important to recognize. And, to those of you that perhaps haven't had the opportunity to think about the relevance of this disease in the grand scheme of, medicine or bleeding disorders, it's a lot more important than it's been given credit for and a lot more common than it's been given credit for. So now to treatment, all right? So I recently published a study called How I Treat Bleeding, or an article, not a study, called How I Treat Bleeding in HHT in the journal Blood, which is a journal primarily for hematologists. And this is the what we call visual abstract for the study or for the article. And so what this means is it kind of as a picture or pictorial summary. And I want to highlight some of these things because I think they're just absolutely critically important. So required supportive care in all patients, right? It's really important that everybody have a nasal moisturization regimen, including saline nasal sprays or gels and air humidification. We're now in the winter time in the United States. And so, it's very important that in that dry winter air, you have a humidifier in the bedroom and at home. To minimize bleeding from just plain old dry mucosa in the nose. And then critically important, one of the major pillars of HHT treatment is the treatment of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. And the expectation should be maintenance of a normal hemoglobin, in other words, normal blood counts. Which is, for those of you who know these labs that your doctors order, means a ferritin of at least 50 and a transferrin saturation of at least 20%. And if it's not there, your iron therapy needs to be intensified, and that may mean intravenous iron if you aren't already getting intravenous iron. So for people, if you have an acute unstable bleed, a really problematic bleed, then the thing to do is, you have to go to the emergency room. You got to get treated right away, and they'll use procedures to deal with that treatment, or packing, which is appropriate in the nose, potentially cautery in the gastrointestinal tract if your bleed is in your gut. and IV antifibrinolytics, which is a type of medication that strengthens blood clots. It's hemostatic, meaning it stops bleeding by strengthening blood clots. And this is a medication that lasts for a short period of time, but can really be helpful. Sometimes we use these drugs, and they include medicines like Amicar or aminocaproic acid or Lystida or tranexamic acid. We can give those as pills as well to folks that have bleeding on the more mild end of things. And that is represented in the bottom left part of the figure, antifibrinolytic therapy. But then where I really want to focus, and what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this presentation, is the new stuff, right? The disease-modifying drugs. So clinical trials of novel agents. If patients have, if you have moderate to severe bleeding in HHT, which is defined a number of different ways, that's beyond the scope of this, but essentially, if your bleeding is really impacting your life, if it's impacting your ability to work, your ability to go to school, if it's causing you emotional upset, if it's causing you financial problems, if it's causing you anxiety around having nosebleeds in public, if it's causing social isolation, if it's causing an inability to be in a romantic relationship or concerns regarding that, any of those things and more, it is likely moderate or severe severity bleeding in HHT. And the consideration of these treatments are really appropriate. And as Riley alluded to in opening up this presentation, we have no approved drugs for the treatment of HHT right now, no FDA-approved therapeutics. And that's a big problem. We want to change that with many of these drugs that are coming down the pipeline and these clinical trials I'm going to tell you about very briefly here. But if clinical trials are really the first thing, and I'll explain why those are usually the best option for folks if you have them available. But if they're not available, then we have some drugs that we use a reasonable amount these days off the setting of a clinical trial in certain circumstances, and that includes pomalidomide and bevacizumab, and I'll mention those briefly here in a minute. So I get a question all the time. Does being on a clinical trial mean I'm a guinea pig? Or some people just assume that it means that they're a guinea pig. And I want to disabuse everybody of that right now. The answer to that is no. It most certainly does not. Clinical trials are simply the safest and really the best way to receive new therapies. Why is that? Well, we enroll, as doctors, we enroll people on clinical trials for three really critical reasons. Okay, number one, to do what's best for the patient. Number two, to do what's best for the patient. And number three, to do what's best for the patient. All right. I know that seems a little repetitive, but I think it bears just saying, because when I offer a clinical trial to my patient, it's because I think that is possibly the best option for them, or it's a really good option to consider along with the other options. Trials have eligibility criteria, essentially ensuring people are safe to receive the drug in question to maximize safety. So you don't have to wonder, am I safe to receive this drug? Your doctor won't be able to put you on the trial if you have a pre-existing medical problem that is a concern in that regard. Patients on clinical trials really are VIPs. At my hospital, at MGH, they get a research coordinator assigned to them, which is a logistical person they can call for all the logistical issues. In many circumstances, these clinical trials come with logistical support. So, the research coordinator can, if it's offered by the study, they can schedule a ride for the patient to and from the hospital for their visits, or a hotel, or what have you. This is a sort of thing that's really, lessens the burden of having to come into the hospital for visits. And also a research RN, a registered nurse, who is available to answer questions or issues at any time. And you have both of these assigned to you if you enroll in a clinical trial in my hospital. There are also more staff and hospital resources dedicated to the care of patients on clinical trials and other patients. And trials also, in addition to offering logistical support for participation, may offer access to very expensive drugs for free, which is obviously a very a positive thing in this age of challenges dealing with insurance companies. While clinical trials may come with a chance of receiving a placebo, which is a treatment that does nothing for a period of time, because again, clinical trials are often comparing a new therapy against a placebo. All current and recent placebo-controlled trials in HHT have what's called open label extension. So that means that after the period of time in which somebody might be getting a placebo, which is called the double-blind period, because we don't know, the patient doesn't know whether they're getting active drug or placebo, and the doctor doesn't know whether the patient is getting active drug or placebo. That's why it's called double-blind. Everybody gets the drug eventually. So it's drug now versus drug later in this circumstance. And to my knowledge, there has not been an HHT trial recently, a major HHT trial as of recent, or of the ones that are currently ongoing, that does not have this option. So people usually have access to the drug. And if it's not an open label extension, it may be a drug access program or preferential treatment for access to free drug. There's all sorts of ways that this ultimately gets accomplished. Okay, so I'm going to share with you all some data. Okay, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I think some of these figures are helpful to think about when we think about how these drugs potentially work. But I want to caution everyone that you can't compare numbers from one study of one drug to studies of another drug, or even studies of the same drug in a different population, because the way you do that, the way you compare drugs in this way, is through head-to-head studies. And none of these studies I'm about to show you are head-to-head studies. All of them are studies that have no comparison arm, or the comparison arm is a placebo. And patients enrolled on every study are different in many ways, including severity, whether they're nosebleed or epistaxis predominant versus gastrointestinal bleeding predominant, et cetera. So you can't, it's like comparing apples to oranges. But the purpose here is to show you what patients receiving these therapeutics, what they've received. Now, I think many of you are familiar with the epistaxis severity score, but just very briefly, because a lot of the trials use this. This is a clinical measurement that your doctor will take from you by asking you questions about your nosebleeds that probably everybody in the webinar has had done to them multiple times at this point. But it ranks nosebleed severity between 0 and 10. Okay, very simple. 0 is no nosebleeds, 10 is the worst nosebleeding. So improvement in this score is what we look for when we use the score in clinical trials. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about bevacizumab, and one of the brand names for this is Avastin or Avastin. And this is a drug that it's not terribly new in the HHT space, in that we've been doing clinical trials of it. We've been evaluating it for a number of years. But I think it's important to mention there is an ongoing National Institutes of Health sponsored clinical trial of this drug called Trust HHT going on just at Massachusetts General Hospital HHT Center. And this trial is ongoing. I don't have data to share for this trial, but I will share prior data from a different study called Inhibit Bleed that evaluated bevacizumab in HHT. And this is a figure that shows the impact of the drug on hemoglobin, which is a measure of the red blood cells. And when your hemoglobin is low, you're anemic and you feel crummy and you feel fatigued and you have no energy, and you may have all sorts of other issues, including hair loss and mind fog. And it's not a good thing to be anemic. And in this study, we see that treatment with bevacizumab improved the hemoglobin by about 25 to 30% in these patients, and brought most people out of anemia, which was very promising. And we see the effect on the epistaxis severity score. It dropped substantially in patients, and that effect was maintained over time. Okay, this study was not a placebo-controlled study, so there's no placebo arm to compare this with, which is not as ideal as if there were a placebo arm, because there are placebo effects, as we know. But nevertheless, this is an option that we have available on clinical trial right now at Mass General, and that is potentially available depending on where you are outside of the setting of a clinical trial as well. And this drug has been shown also to make the telangiectasias on people's faces and in their mouth fade, and that is obviously very satisfying for everybody involved. The PATH HHT study was recently finished, and this is a study of a pill. Bevacizumab is an intravenous infusion, Avastin intravenous infusion, which is one of the main challenges with it, and we usually reserve it for more severe patients. Pomalidomide is a pill that's taken once a day. And this study was completed. This was called Path HHT. This was also a study sponsored by the government, the National Institutes of Health. And this study did have a placebo arm. It randomized patients, meaning they were assigned randomly to receive either active pomalidomide or placebo for 6 months. And this study, I won't go through all of these details, but just to say that 144 patients were enrolled in this study at a number of centers around the United States. This was a United States specific study. 95 were randomized, or 95 were randomized to pomalidomide, and 49 were randomized to placebo. And we can see the pomalidomide arm in blue and the placebo arm in red, and lower is better. And we see that there was some placebo effect in people in terms of their epistaxis severity score, ESS, again, out of 10. But we see that the pomalidomide arm was clearly better. And this was a really remarkable result for this study. Actually ended early because the Safety Monitoring Board felt that it was no longer appropriate to randomize people to placebo because the drug had proven its effectiveness in what's called an interim analysis. This was true whether people had more moderate bleeding or more severe bleeding. Their initial ESS was high or lower. It didn't really matter so much. And when we look at the duration, patients in this study also kept track of their bleeding with an app in their phone. And we look at the duration that they had, they logged nosebleeds. We saw that there was really substantial improvement relative to the placebo arm in people receiving pomalidomide. This shows intensity-weighted epistaxis duration. So the amount of minutes they bled weighted by how severe they commented the bleeding was, whether it was dripping versus gushing, for example. Now, this is a measurement called the HHT-specific quality of life score. And so why do we do any of this, right? We want to make patients' lives better. We want to make people have improved functioning, feel better in all ways of their life. And this is called quality of life. And we saw that people receiving pomalidomide had a much better improvement in their quality of life score than people receiving placebo. And again, you can see the placebo arm improve at first, and that's because of a placebo effect, which is why it's important to do placebo-controlled trials. But then those patients, their numbers then drift back toward baseline, whereas the pomalidomide patients continue to maintain their improvement. I'll skip this. And this study was, again, published in a major medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and was the first HHT study of a clinical HHT clinical trial to be published in the New England Journal, which, again, is a big milestone for this neglected disease. So Riley mentioned the ongoing pazopanib study. Pazopanib is also a pill. It's taken once daily. And like pomalidomide, both of these drugs, and also like bevacizumab or Avastin, all three of these drugs, I should have mentioned this to the other ones, are currently approved to treat cancer. They are cancer treatments that have been repurposed to treat HHT because we recognize that they can be effective in HHT. And pazopanib, this clinical trial is currently ongoing. The eligibility requirements were recently updated to be less stringent. So, if you are interested in a novel therapy, potentially disease-modifying therapy to treat your bleeding, I would recommend that you talk to your doctor and see where, if you're at an HHT center, see if they have the study open, and if not, see where the closest site that has the study open is. And again, this study is a randomized study that randomizes people to receive pazopanib or placebo, 50% chance of either, and receive that for a 6-month period. And then after that, everybody can continue on what's called an open label extension to receive active drug, active pazopanib. And this study, this drug, like pomalidomide and bevacizumab or Avastin, the benefit here is a reduction in the drive for the body to grow these abnormal blood vessels, to develop telangiectasias and AVMs. And so the main thing that we evaluate in these studies are bleeding, because that's very readily evaluable, and it's something that unites almost every patient with HHT. But one of the things we also hope when we use these medicines to treat people is that it may have a positive impact on AVMs inside organs. That's a whole separate issue, though, and something that will be addressed more formally with future studies. But pazopanib is, again, this is an ongoing available study. So if you're interested, seek it out. I have a figure from a prior pazopanib study that was done that was not a placebo-controlled study, but I think is really illustrative of the benefits of potentially disease-modifying therapy, whether with pazopanib or with other drugs that I've talked about. And that is the ability to reduce bleeding to the point where blood transfusions and IV iron are dramatically reduced. Every dot, every line, horizontal line on this, what's called a swimmer plot, is a person, a patient over time. And every red dot is a blood transfusion. Every blue diamond was an IV iron infusion. And you see very dramatic amounts of blue dots and red circles in the first, on the left side, which is before initiation of pazopanib. And then afterwards, you see how things improved. And these patients, I think, had a really remarkable response, and it's not necessarily the case for everybody. But this is just an example of why these medications, just as a general statement, can be quite helpful. Lastly, I want to talk about some of the first industry-sponsored studies in HHT. So all of the studies I mentioned before are with drugs that are already approved for cancer that are being sponsored by the government. This study and the next drug I mentioned are medications that are being developed by pharmaceutical companies specifically for the treatment of HHT. And VAD044 is the first drug that's being developed by a pharmaceutical industry specifically to treat HHT by a company called Vaderis. And this study is currently ongoing in the open label extension phase, but the first portion of the study, the double-blind study, has completed. I don't have, because the primary results haven't been published yet, only presented at national meetings, I can't include specific figures from like I did for the other studies. But needless to say, was announced and already presented at the annual meetings, the American Society of Hematology annual meeting and the HHT meeting back in October, that this was a positive study and that the drug performed quite well in this study against placebo. So very promising, and a number of patients that were able to take advantage of the study are currently still receiving drug in the open label extension. There will be more, the expectation here is that there will be an additional study of this drug in the future that would potentially be available for all of you. I sometimes get asked about, and I just have a very brief slide in here, about use of hormonal agents like tamoxifen or use of the antibiotic doxycycline in HHT. And I'll start with doxycycline. We've had 2 randomized controlled trials now, meaning trials in which doxycycline was compared with placebo that were negative, meaning they did not show a benefit for doxycycline. So I don't recommend that treatment for folks at this time. And then hormonal agents like tamoxifen and estrogen, it can be potentially helpful in improving bleeding, but they have blood clotting risks that are very clear and proven. Some of the other drugs that I mentioned have theoretical blood clotting risks. These drugs have very known, proven, clear blood clotting risks, these hormonal agents. So, we generally speaking, they're not recommended in the HHT guidelines anymore for this reason. Lastly, there's a company called Diagonal Therapeutics, and those of you that went to the HHT meeting in France this year may have seen a presentation from them. They're developing what's called an agonist antibody, and that's an antibody that activates a protein in the body. And it activates the specific pathway that there's a genetic mutation in HHT that causes reduced activity. So if the pathway is currently running, that those proteins are running at 50% efficiency in people with HHT, the idea is that giving them this medicine might rev that up All right. And so that's certainly a promising potential mechanism. I say all I have here is more to come because this is still in its early stages. But this is, the company announced that they're committed to developing a drug in HHT in this regard. And so I think this is a potentially very promising treatment as well. I just have another slide here. I know Riley already mentioned it, but the HHT impact study, and again, this study is being sponsored by Cure HHT and Diagonal Therapeutics. And this is just essentially a natural history studies trying to understand more about the HHT patient experience because there's not enough data out there about this. And the more people understand that this is a really severe, really bad disease, a really problematic disease, the more funding and more attention it can get from the various stakeholders, government, industry, and so on. So with that, I think I went a little bit over, but still plenty of time to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari. We so greatly appreciate the time, expertise, and thoroughness of your presentation and everybody with us today. Hope you found that impactful. We'll now open things up for Q&A. I see we have a few coming up in the Q&A box. Please do take advantage of this time and ask your questions. I also have a handful of questions that many of you submitted before our webinar. So I'll be bouncing back and forth between those. Dr. Al-Samkari, before I start sorting through these questions and pose the first one, more generally, I just wanted to ask, why is it beneficial or important for there one day to be multiple therapeutic options?
Yeah,
within
that's a
HHT?
great question, Riley. Thank you. So I presented some really nice data from a lot of prior studies of these drugs, but it's all about finding the right drug for the right patient. There's a reason why those numbers don't improve completely. The drug works. Each of these drugs works for some people and doesn't work for others. And sometimes drugs work for a while and they stop working. So we need an armamentarium of drugs really to treat bleeding alone, and then drugs that we know have a positive impact on the visceral AVMs, the lung and liver and brain AVMs as well. That's another thing that we need. So a sister disorder to HHT is hemophilia, as I mentioned before. There are dozens of approved therapeutics for hemophilia. There's gene therapy that's a functional cure for people with hemophilia. All of those therapeutics are needed, and there's still even remaining unmet need in hemophilia, despite the fact that there's over a dozen approved therapies. So, we need the same in HHT. We need, as providers, medicines that, we can move on to if the current medicine stops working. If we try medicine for you and it doesn't work, then we need to be able to try something else. And so we really need an armamentarium of drugs. And it's my hope that all of these drugs and more will ultimately be part of that armamentarium.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that answer. As for some of our questions, there's a theme among several questions, both in the chat and those that many of you sent before registration about GI bleeding, with several patients saying, my nosebleeds are okay, but GI is my real problem. And do any of these drugs impact GI bleeding?
Yeah, that's a great question. GI bleeding is a huge problem in HHT. And yes, the short answer is they do. It's a lot harder to measure GI bleeding than it is to measure nose bleeding, right? Because it's tougher to know exactly. Most people who have GI bleeding also have nose bleeding, and it's difficult to know exactly when the blood count numbers go down, how much of that was from GI bleeding, how much was from nose bleeding. So clinical trials like to evaluate what is more readily evaluable, and nose bleeding in this case a little bit more readily evaluable, which is why much of the things looked at are ESS or epistaxis severity score. But yes. Bevacizumab in particular, or Avastin, is a medication that has a good amount of data for it to support for treatment of gastrointestinal bleeding. Pomalidomide primarily evaluated nose bleeding in the PATH-HHT study. We did take a look at pomalidomide and possible impact on gastrointestinal bleeding, and it certainly can work. My overall sense, and again, this is with caution because we don't have studies comparing the two, is that pomalidomide may be a bit better for nose bleeding and bevacizumab may be a bit better for gastrointestinal bleeding, even though they both can work for both. Okay. Pazopanib also in prior studies, almost every single one of those patients that I showed on that prior I'll pull it up here on this study, of 13 patients who received pazopanib. Almost all of these patients had gastrointestinal bleeding. So gastrointestinal bleeding is likely, it is treatable with bevacizumab, with pomalidomide, and with pazopanib. We can't tell you up front which of the which drugs will work best for you. There is some trial and error here, but the answer is yes. And we don't know so much about VAD44 in gastrointestinal bleeding, but we believe it should work just like it works for nosebleeds.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Dennis in the chat here is asking a question that we saw in our pre-registration questions too, which is about potentially having therapeutic options for teenagers, children. Are these studies open to them, or what might the future look like there if you got your crystal ball out?
Thank you. No, thank you for that question. That's a really important question, something I should have addressed. So all of these studies are in adults. The eligibility criteria require people to be 18 years old in order to enroll in any of these studies. And we certainly did have people, ranging, I think, from 19 to 91 on these studies. So for adults, the whole age range is potentially appropriate for these therapies. But none of these drugs have been evaluated in any reasonable way, certainly not in any good controlled trial in children to treat HHT in people less than 18. It's not as though something magical happens when you're, 17 and 364 days, and then the next day you become 18. But, there is a recognition that children are not just little adults, and that, children are growing, and there are a lot of, different aspects to children's health. And so in general, we don't use these quote unquote disease modifying drugs in children right now. I think that there may be an opportunity in the future to do appropriate studies for children that have really severe HHT manifestations, but and with these drugs. But I think in general, right now, we focus on treatment of bleeding in HHT and children with HHT with antifibrinolytics, which is again that other type of medicine that strengthens blood clots, medicines like aminocaproic acid or tranexamic acid. And that works well for most children with HHT bleeding, because bleeding typically gets worse over the lifespan and is typically not as bad in the younger years. And again, if that's not adequate, procedures are an option as well.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for that answer. We're getting a lot of questions, as you might imagine, about both timeline, things like when might these drugs, Vaderis is being called out by Monique here in the chat, be available and potentially get approval. And a second question is about effectiveness over time of the different options, if you want to tackle those.
Yeah, very good questions. So in terms of timeline, the PATH-HHT study is done. The TRUST-HHT study is ongoing, but again, we have data for bevacizumab already in HHT. These treatments are potentially available for you primarily through HHT centers, depending on the expertise of your doctor. They may be available outside of HHT centers as well. Primarily, these are medicines prescribed by hematologists, oncologists. So that's something that may be potentially available right now for a number of folks. In terms of the pazopanib study, that is ongoing, and likely we're looking still at something like 2026 before we get final results available from that study. In terms of Vaderis, right, I mentioned that with the positive initial study, we expect another study. The larger studies, the pivotal, what we call pivotal phase 3 studies, usually are a 2 to 3 year endeavor. And so, we're talking about 2027, 2028, most likely, before there would be, if the studies are successful, an approval, for example, for, the either pazopanib or Vaderis drug VAD44. So I think that is, it's not as fast as we would like. It moves faster than it used to, I'll say that. But I will say this as well, once there is an approval in this disease, I think the floodgates are going to open. I think there's going to be a lot more interest from pharmaceutical industry in developing therapeutics, which will be hugely beneficial for all of the patients. But we got to make it to that first approved drug. And I think, Riley, the second question you asked me was about long-term effectiveness. Is that right?
Effectiveness over time. Yep.
Yeah. So that's something that's been evaluated in bevacizumab or Avastin. Most people will have effectiveness for a period of years. Everybody is different, right? So I should say very plainly that, right, you are different than anybody else who, is presenting in these studies. And, everybody has specific needs and the drugs will impact them specifically differently than other people. But oftentimes we get nice durable response. That's one of the positives of medical therapy with a disease-modifying drug over something like a cautery, right? We are able to control the disease for a period of time that's measured in years. And I've had patients that remain on bevacizumab now for 8 years, that have been on pomalidomide for 4 or 5 years with excellent control of their bleeding and their disease, and very happy. And so, those are the drugs we've been using the longest. We don't know for some of the newer drugs because, again, they're newer. We haven't been using them for all that long. But that durability is one of the benefits. Now, that's not true for everybody. And sometimes after 3, 4, 5 years, the medicine may stop working. We may need to switch you to a different medicine. But that's a time horizon that's usually much better than a lot of these procedures that we previously would reach for.
We're also seeing a lot of liver questions. If any of these therapeutics could help treat liver, AVMs, prevent heart failure, et cetera.
Yeah. So the short answer is I certainly hope so. We have some data for bevacizumab or Avastin in that regard, that it can be helpful for a subset of people with liver AVMs, not everyone. So that's something that can be considered. These both pazopanib and VAD044 are also being evaluated as a secondary thing in addition to bleeding in terms of the impact on potential high output heart failure and on liver AVMs. And so we don't have the answers to that yet, but more to come. And I would say right now for people who have clinically, either they have liver AVMs and have high output heart failure already, or they have clear liver disease from the liver AVMs, talk to your HHT center director, get referred, see somebody who is, if you don't have an HHT center director that is taking care of you, then make a visit to your nearest HHT center. I think it's appropriate to have a discussion about whether or not use of these medications to try to treat those liver AVMs, because they can be helpful, is appropriate, because we all know that the only other option is a liver transplant, and that's extremely challenging to even get. So it's something that I have a number of patients on these drugs that have stable or improving liver AVMs, and so we think that's very important. I can't present a study for you yet because it hasn't been, we haven't gotten to that point, and so these are more anecdotal instances, but they certainly can work.
Thank you for that answer. We have so many questions coming in. We'll do our best to get to everybody if we're not able to get to you in our time here today, as we do just have a few minutes left. So I'll try to fly through as many as possible.
We'll do lightning round, Riley. I know
right. Like some of these might be challenging to do lightning round. For example, gene therapy. How soon might that become available in HHT?
Gene therapy is currently, I'm a hematologist. We have gene therapy in other blood diseases, other bleeding disorders like hemophilia. We have gene therapy in thalassemia and sickle cell disease. These are all diseases that we see and take care of in people with blood disorders. And the bottom line is we don't have it available in HHT yet. But HHT is potentially amenable to gene therapy technology. It's different than these other drugs, these other diseases. It's a little bit more challenging, but it is most certainly not out of the realm. It's a disease that gene therapy could potentially be effective in. we have to get industry interest because it's extremely expensive to develop those therapies. But again, I am hopeful, and I believe that interest will come. So that's a 2030s kind of thing. I'll leave it at that.
Appreciate that answer. The next one I have here, particularly interesting question is, will the type of genetic mutation impact choice of
That's
future
an
treatment?
excellent question. Every time we've looked at the type of genetic mutation and potential impact on it in terms of response to therapy with these drugs that I've talked about, we haven't found any relationship. So whether you're endoglin mutated, ALK1 mutated, it does not seem to matter. You may or may not respond, and it's not something that you, or if you don't have a known mutation, but you have clinical HHT, the moral of that story is you can still get treated.
Thank you very much. I have some questions about any of these treatments and or future potential treatments' ability to shrink, reverse, diffuse pulmonary AVMs.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one that we wish we knew the answer to. And I don't know the answer to, and it's not something that we've had adequate study of. We need to study it. It's a significant unmet need. I hear you, and I absolutely recognize, and I have patients that have this problem that I want to help. Unfortunately, right now, I can't point you to a specific drug or say something will clearly work. At the same time, I do think you have to weigh risks and benefits and talk with your doctor about possibly, whether trying something may be reasonable to do.
We have some other questions about combination therapies. Is there a potential to be on multiple?
There is a potential to be on multiple, but we are not at that point right now. And any use of combination therapies involving multiple so-called disease-modifying therapies, it should be limited to a clinical trial, because we don't know, whether or not combining, for example, pazopanib and pomalidomide, for example, whether that would be safe, or if there's, potential side effects that could emerge when you add both drugs together. We do combine antifibrinolytics with these disease-modifying therapies, so-called anti-angiogenic therapies, all the time, and the evidence there suggests that that's safe to do.
Thank you. Last question here for you. I'm not sure the depth to which you'll be able to answer this question, but also seeing a lot of questions from patients in Canada asking about access to these therapies one day and what that might look like.
Access is a huge deal, huge deal. Every country is different. I can speak for the United States, in which, most people have Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance. And in those circumstances, it's all a matter of whether or not the insurance will cover certain medication. And that's a very complex discussion. What I would say to people in the US is, try. If you might be told no, but it's not unreasonable to try if your doctor decides it's appropriate for you to receive one of these medications, they can try and see if it's covered. In Canada, I'm aware that bevacizumab is available at HHT centers in Canada. For example, in Toronto, the access to it, I understand, and I'm not an expert in the Canadian system, but is somewhat more restricted outside of certain centers. So you may need to be doing some traveling. But this is a problem not just for Canada. A lot of countries in Europe, it can be very challenging, and elsewhere in the world, it can be very challenging to access these medications. They're not cheap. If there's clinical trial opportunities, that is, again, a great opportunity to get access, because trials often, not always, allow access to the drug for free.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Samkari. Any closing remarks or messages to the community on with us here today before a few additional closing words for myself?
Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for listening. Kudos to you for taking charge and learning about your disease and trying to improve your health, and being a good advocate for yourself by coming to this webinar and other Cure HHT webinars. I would just say, I'd echo something I said at the beginning, which is that we're moving so much faster than we used to, and things are better now considerably than they were just a few years ago, and they will be. I am confident they'll be even better a few years from now. So for those of you suffering with this disease, be hopeful.
Really appreciate that message. Moreover, appreciate the time here today, the openness to questions. even moreover for the time and leadership to help us reach this place and all the effort you've made personally on these studies and the care of your patients at your center. It's going to take all of us, from the researchers, the clinicians, from our organization, bringing the patient perspective and connecting studies to patients, but also the patients as well, to participate in these trials so we can acquire the data to continue to progress along these timelines to bring hopefully many therapeutic options to market. At the end of the day, at Cure HHT, we are your organization, we are a patient organization, and we are here to help you. We're just a phone call, an email away. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any additional follow-up questions from today's webinar or any additional questions about yourself and your care. On behalf of all of us at Cure HHT, Dr. Hanny Al-Samkari, we greatly appreciate the time here today, and we hope everybody has a safe and happy holidays.
Pleasure. Happy holidays, everyone.
Take care, everybody.